بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. My name is Hamza the historian, as I'm sure you're all very aware, and this is going to be an open Q&A. There's a chat box there. You can put one question per minute, but feel free to ask me whatever questions you want. If you want to know what's my position or opinion on this or that matter, I'm not issuing fatwas or anything like that. No fatwa here. Just giving my opinion as someone who has dedicated their life to the study of Islam and its history. You can see the frames behind me. Those are some of my ijazas, some of the many books that I have and study. So, yeah, as a historian, an academic, a former imam, I am here to answer whatever questions people may have. I know things have been very intense with the conflict in the Middle East. And me being in an Islamic studies department at a university, definitely everything that's been going on in current events, we feel quite heavily. And politics has gotten quite crazy as well. So I'm here just to talk about any kind of issues or contemporary things or stuff from the past, from history, whatever things that you'd like me to talk about. Otherwise, I can move on to questions that were previously submitted to my channel. And in the last Q&A video, we looked at the question, which books do you recommend for the history of the Arabs? English and Arabic books. And I mostly focused on English books. So I thought now I could probably give some Arabic books. So behind me, right there, you see Al-Jami' fi As-Sira Nabawiyya by Samira El-Zayed. I highly recommend that for early Islamic history. It's 6 volumes. Should be able to find it on Nil wa Furat. The English translation, which is this green one right there, you can find at Daybreak Press, which is based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And then you have the Musannaf, and this Musannaf, one of Abdurrahman al-San'ani and of Musannaf Ibn Abi Shayba. Those are really early hadith collections that predate like Bukhari and Muslim and all of that. These were written by the people that were known as the Ahl al-Hadith versus the Ahl Ra'i. So there's a lot of early Islamic history in those books there. And then, of course, most people, they know of Tariq al-Tabari or what's the one by al-Mas'udi? His name is al-Mas'udi. Something Fidl wal-Dhahab. I can't remember. Meadows of Gold or something. It's not as important as, Tariq al-Tabari, but it is out there. Another one that people really like that's more recent is called Shadharat al-Dhahab fi Akhbar min al-Dhahab. All right, and that's a multi-volume book. Let's see, the publisher Dar Ibn Kathir, they have it as a 10-volume set, I believe. And it's freely, all these books are easily found on PDF online for free. But I think those are really good books on Arab history in Arabic that will give you decent introduction. And of course, you have Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun, his stuff's easily available online as well in Arabic. all of Tarikh al-Tabari has been translated into English. So that is very easy to find English PDFs of Tarikh al-Tabari online. So yeah, those are kind of the main books in Arabic I would look at. It also depends what era in Arab history that you're talking about, or like what in particular within Arabic history do you want to focus on? Like, do you want to focus on the history of Arab women merchants in Basra, Iraq in the 10th century? There's going to be specific books on that. So just keep that in mind. Arab academics, they do produce quite a bit of research on history. So there's all kinds of books out there on the most like niche subjects you can imagine. Um, but if you want just an overview, I think I would start, with Tarikh al-Tabari, because there's a full English translation. You can follow it along with the Arabic. But Shadrat al-Dhahab, which was actually recommended to me by Professor Ito, at Vanderbilt University. And I found the book quite beneficial. So yeah, that concludes that question for now. If I think of anything else, I will mention it. So another question that comes in here: what is your opinion on the books like Ibn Kathir and Tabari, who choose to narrate from Christian and Jewish sources? For example, the sons of Adam, like Cain or Abel, or Seth. These names are not found in the Quran or authentic hadith. So, Cain and Abel and Seth, they are mentioned in Islamic sources, and they are mentioned in Israeliyyāt, and what I assume you're talking about, and this is by Tahmid Islam 5208, is you're talking about Israeliyyāt. And Israeliyyāt, they are narrations from Jewish and Christian sources. And basically, how the ulama used those was with a grain of salt. They said, there's nothing in the Islamic tradition that this contradicts, but there's nothing that affirms it or corroborates it either. So you can think it's true or not, or corroborates it either. So you can think it's true or not think it's true. That's your own kind of personal conviction. And sometimes you will find corroborating evidence. And there are these figures mentioned in tafsir, different tafsir, exegesis that's out there. And even the medieval books on like Qisas al-Anbiya, they mention Seth, Cain and Abel, these types of things. Even Seth is mentioned by Ibn Arabi as one of the prophets in his Fusus al-Hikam, ringstones of wisdom or bezels of wisdom. So yeah, they are considered prophets in the Islamic tradition, according to many ulama. So I would look into that. There probably are some hadiths out there. Now, as to their authenticity, I don't know, about that. I'm not a muhaddith or anything. But there are muhaddithin out there who could, have written books on those types of hadith and things where you could figure that out. The Arnaut brothers are really famous, like hadith editors. And so if you go to their like version of Bukhari or Tirmidhi or Musnad Ahmed or whatever it may be, they tell you in it if they consider the hadith to be sahih or Hasan al-Ghayri, Sahih al-Ghayri, and things like that. They'll give you basically what the gradation level of the hadith is. And then if those hadith are authentic or not through that way. So yeah, I would, if you can give me the specific hadith, I would be able to answer your question probably better. And so the next question coming in, what do you think of heresy and the formation of medieval Islamic orthodoxy, the making of Sunnism from 8th to 11th century by Ahmed Khan? So I have not read this book, but we can look it up. So let me try to pull it up here. So I can't really give you a real opinion, but I can at least look up the book and talk about that. So let me see here. Heresy and Reformation. Okay, so I'm at Cambridge University Press's website. Okay, so I got the table of contents. So looks like he gets into discussions of heresy and from 800 to 850, from 850 to 950. And then he goes into regionalism, topographies of heresy, ethnogenesis, and heresy politics and heresy religion and society, manaqib, narratives of orthodoxy, masanid, narratives of orthodoxy number 2. Okay, so what this looks like, just from the table of contents, is that it's probably a book on social history. Okay, so book description. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, many defining features of classical Sunni Islam began to take shape. Amongst these was the formation of medieval Sunnism around the belief in the unimpeachable orthodoxy of 4 eponymous founders and their schools of law. In this original study, Ahmed Khan explores the history and cultural memory of one of these eponymous founders, Abu Hanifa, showing how Abu Hanifa evolved from being the object of intense religious exclusion to a pillar of Sunni orthodoxy. Khan examines the concepts of orthodoxy and heresy and outlines their changing meanings. Over the course of 4 centuries, he demonstrates that orthodoxy and heresy were neither fixed theological categories. Well, obviously, there's always ikhtilaf and difference of opinion in Islam, nor pious fictions, but instead were impacted by everything from law and politics to society and culture. This book illuminates the significant, yet often neglected transformations in Islamic social, political, and religious thought during this vibrant period. And then it's got some little, blurbs. So one's from Jonathan A.C. Brown at Georgetown University. It says, in important parts of the Middle East and South Asia's vast Sunni Muslim population, Islam and the school of practice initiated by Abu Hanifa have long been nearly synonymous. However, for the medieval clerics who first spoke of Sunni Islam, Abu Hanifa was a heretic. This rich and careful study details how Sunni Islam expanded to admit Abu Hanifa and the broad diversity of thought and practice found in the Muslim world today. So, I think that this book is probably focusing mostly on, you could say, cultural history. That's where you put social history and intellectual history together. And looks like Ahmed Khan is at the American University in Cairo, which I've been to. Ooh, this book hardcover is $120. But I might have to read this book here now that I'm on winter break from university, especially since it's about Abu Hanifa, and I specialize in early Hanafi history, as I'm sure many of you know from my series on Hanafi history. So I think I will have to check this book out. Um, yeah, so I can't tell you really what the ideas are in the book, um, like what the claims are or major arguments, because I haven't read it. But the way I try to get a summary of books, especially academic ones, is I just look up academic book reviews. And whenever you read a book review, an academic book review of an academic book, um, they give a brief summary. That's kind of considered standard. And they may or may not engage with the arguments or claims made in the book. But just reading an academic book review should usually give you a good summary of what the book is saying. And so then you have an idea what the book is saying. You look at the table of contents like I just did, and you get a good idea how the book's organized and what's going to be talked about where. Then the next step I usually do is I read the introduction, which usually also tells you even further than the book reviews what's going to be in which chapter and what the book's about, what the major claims are. And then you go read the conclusion. Most academic books are designed this way intentionally, so you can read it in this way and get a summary. It's all done intentionally. So you read the introduction, and then you go straight to the conclusion or the last chapter, and you would read the conclusion then, like after the data has been presented, and you get an idea even more what was covered in the book, what claims are being made, because usually they put all the major overarching claims in the conclusion and a summary because they're trying to wrap it all up and put it into perspective, reframe all the data they just presented, perhaps. Um, and then you have a good idea what the book's saying. If you want to get into something specific, you can do that and go to a specific chapter and get more into it. And you can decide if you want to read all of the book, part of the book, or what you're going to do. That's usually how I approach academic books, and in any language. It could be in French or in Arabic or German or Spanish, what have you. And that's a good way to approach most nonfiction books. But even fiction books you can read reviews of and get the gist of, or read synopses and spark notes and all that kind of thing. So the next question. I have a specific question about an issue that took place in 10th century Abbasid, the Two Razis debate. This was between the physician, philosopher Abu Bakr al-Razi and the Ismaili theologian Abu Hatim al-Razi. Sarah Stromsa wrote a book, Free Thinkers of Medieval Islam, covering what Razi believes may have been. There has been a debate on whether he was anti-revealed revelation or not, and others have talked about this too. For example, Professor Marwan Rashid and Professor Peter Adamson. My question is, what do you think was going on there in terms of Abu Bakr al-Razi's actual beliefs? My short answer is I have no idea. I have not read about either of these Razis. I am familiar with Professor Peter Adamson. He's got a really good book on Islamic philosophy that I might have around. I was just working with not too long ago, but I don't know where I put it. So yeah, he's really great. I recommend Peter Adamson. I think Muslim should read Peter Adamson's book on Islamic philosophy. It's really quite good. I just reread a chapter out of it a few days ago on Ibn Hazm because I'm working on an academic article where I show how Ibn Arabi borrowed from Ibn Hazm in Zahiri Fiqh. which is something I've written on before, but I'm further elaborating on. And the chat is there for people to submit questions. So, feel free to put any kind of question in the chat. Nothing's really off limits. Okay, and someone says, please suggest the books for studies of Ottoman Empire. So if you go to my original video on how to study Islamic history, I give a pretty good list of books to start with. And so, if you start with Ira Lapidus, History of, I think it's Muslim Societies, um, there's a lot on the Ottoman Empire there, as well as in Hodgson, of course. There are specific books on the Ottoman Empire too, which I could recommend, but they focus usually on like the modern Ottoman Empire, which I have very little interest in. Um, but probably the best book that I've read on Ottoman history was specifically on the history of the Hanafi madhab during the Ottoman period, and that's called The Second Formation of Islamic Law by Guy Burak. I read that maybe 2016. It's a very, very excellent book on how the Hanafi madhab functioned during the Ottoman period. I cite it in my article on the Hanafis. So I highly recommend looking at that because it gives you a really good idea of how Ottoman bureaucracy functioned and how Islamic law and judges and the legal system functioned during the Ottoman period, and how Arabs resisted that, and the Arab ulama, issued their own fiqh opinions, their own Hanafi opinions that contradicted what the Ottoman official Hanafi opinion was, because they had two different curriculums, two different strains of Hanafism, as I mentioned in my article. So if you want to know legal history in the Ottoman Empire, I would take a look at my article Hanafis that I published with Routledge. Okay, books on intellectual history of Islam, like Wael Hallaq, Formation of Islam. So, yes, Peter Adamson has a really great book on Islamic philosophy, like I just mentioned, as well as Ira Lapidus, A History of Muslim Societies. It covers a lot of intellectual history, but its intersection with social movements or what's going on in social history. And for modern stuff, Albert Harani has, I think, one that's called like Arab Thought in the Liberal Age or something like that. And it talks a lot about things like Salafism and talks a lot about like Rashid Rida and all these kinds of early Salafi figures, Hassan al-Banna and the likes. Um, so there are some really good books out there on intellectual history. Um, Boy, there was a new one by a guy named, I think it's like Maritsky or something, Maritzi, that just came out, that I recently used as a textbook when I taught Islamic history. And I think it's just called something like in Islamic intellectual history. Y'all see if I can pull it up here. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not really able to find it, so I'll have to get back to you on that book. Um, One that's really good that I would recommend, it's kind of like a cultural history, again, being the combination of social and intellectual history, is by one of my former professors, Ahmed El-Shamsi, The Canonization of Islamic Law, A Social and Intellectual History. Says here on Amazon. I bought it in 2016, which is when I first read that book. I've since reread it, and I'll probably reread it again. Um, Generally speaking, though, there's not too many books out there that kind of bring everything together. Usually you buy a book, Introduction to Sufism, Introduction to Islamic Law, Introduction to Islamic Theology, and it all gets compartmentalized like that. But The Venture of Islam, which I mentioned earlier by Hodgson, does a really good job at bringing together all the different Islamic sciences and kind of tracing their history and how they're related to social things and political things and things like that. So that's a pretty good one to start with. If you haven't looked at my video, How to Study Islamic History, if you haven't read those list of basic books, I wouldn't go directly into intellectual history. You have to have the full picture before you kind of specialize into a certain part of Islamic history. Otherwise, you're going to make really kind of basic, egregious mistakes and have basic misunderstandings, which is why I made that video in the first place, so people can get all their bases covered before trying to kind of dive into one specific area of Islamic history, if that makes sense. Next question. Assalamu alaikum. Wa alaikum salam. What do you recommend as a first text to study in Hanafi fiqh? Do you also recommend a specific online institute to study Hanafi fiqh? Thank you. So a real good Hanafi book to start out with, like the very baby basics, would be this book. It's in English. It's called The Absolute Essentials of Islam, Faith, Prayer, and the Path of Salvation According to the Hanafi School by Faraz Farid Rabbani. And you can get it pretty cheap. I'm seeing here as cheap as $15. It was published in 2008 by White Thread Press, who I highly recommend. It's only 64 pages, so it's pretty tiny. Gives you a basic, overview of Hanafi fiqh. And then the next one that I recommend is called Ascent to Felicity. And it's written by Shurun Bulali, who is a very famous Hanafi scholar from Egypt to Azhari. And he also wrote the very famous book Nur al-Idah, or Light of Clarification. So this one, Ascent to Felicity, or Maraqi Sa'adat, is a pretty good one to start after you've done the one I previously mentioned. And then after that, you could jump into Nur al-Idah. And then after Nur al-Idah, you would want to start learning Arabic. And you should try to memorize Nur al-Idah. And once you get Arabic under your belt, you can move to Al-Hidayah. Al-Hidayah has been translated fully into English. I have it right here. This kind of beige looking thing on my bookshelf. And then from there, you can jump into the big books, of Hanafi fiqh, which I have all up there. So yeah, those are the ones that I recommend. Do you recommend a specific online institute to study Hanafi fiqh? There are a lot of good ones out there. I think the one that's doing really good work, let me see if I can pull it up here forget what they're called off the top of my head. But they just, if I remember right, released like the Journal of Hanafi Studies. Um, okay, it's called Irshad. Can't tell if it's like foundation, but there's Irshad that has Irshad Foundation. Um, they have really good classes on Hanafi fiqh and Hanafi history, um, ranging from the beginner level all the way to the very advanced. And there's one, Seeker's Hub. I think it's called something else now. Seeker's Guidance. Seeker's Guidance has pretty good stuff on Hanafi fiqh too that I've seen. So yeah, I would take a look at those ones if you're looking for online institutes to study Hanafi fiqh. I did I think I did Nur al-Ilah with Seeker's Guidance many years ago when it was called Seeker's Hub with Faraz Rahmani. Okay, European history books. So I did mention, in my video, how to study Islamic history, the book by Michel Foucault, which was Les mots et les choses. In English, they don't translate the French directly. I think they call it the order of things. Let me look it up here. Yeah, the order of things. Whereas in French, les mots et les choses is the word, like words and things. The words and things. Because it's supposed to be about words and how words kind of organize thought and epistemology. But it is a history of European thought or European philosophy. It's called The Order of Things, an Archaeology of the Human Sciences, translated in English, published 1994 by Vintage Press. And yeah, it's pretty cheap. You get a paperback. That is a good book. Or, there's lots of textbooks out there, like Introduction to Western Civilization is usually what something like that. I would look that up. Michel Foucault, he's got some other good books. Madness and Civilization, Discipline and Punish, The History of Sexuality, all these things. And I'm not saying you need to agree with Foucault. I'm not telling you to read Foucault to agree with him, but he does give really good historical overviews. Now, his philosophical ideas, many of them, they contradict core tenets of Islam. I'm not saying to read that and take that in as just willy-nilly. You want to read in as just willy-nilly. You want to read Foucault critically and get rid of kind of the nonsensical stuff, but still take his history seriously, because he is a very good historian and went to documents that many other people neglected. Okay. Are you still researching Somali Hanafis in Zayla? So I would love to continue researching the history of Hanafis in Zayla, but I haven't really found any new materials, no primary sources. If someone can get me some manuscripts or some sort of material history or something new about it, I would be more than happy to look into it and write on it and that type of stuff. But as of now, I have not had access to more materials on that. But I would very much like to know more about the Zayla'i Hanafis, because there's so many Hanafi books that end in the name Zayla'i, but we don't know who were these Zayla'is. We don't know a whole lot about them. But what we do know about them, I did put in my article. I believe, as far as I know, I'm the first person to focus on Hanafis in Somalia. I'm the first person to write on it ever. I've never seen anyone else focus on that as its own topic before, which is why I decided to do it, because I think it's an important part of Somali history that people tend to forget. And it's an important part of Hanafi history that people tend to forget. They want to whitewash or Arab wash or Pakistani wash history, and Hanafi madhab is way bigger than those ethnic groups, of course. And we must remember that there's Chinese Hanafis, Central Asian Hanafis, Eastern European Hanafis, North African Hanafis, and so on and so forth. Hanafi madhab has been practiced in Cairo and Qayrawan for, long time, right? Is there any research on Hanafis in Herat or Harar? Oh, Harar, Ethiopia and Yemen. So all of the medieval manuscripts from Ethiopia that I've looked over, and there are online databases, I haven't seen anything other than Shafi'i. Yemen, I have not heard of any Hanafis in Yemen. They may very well exist. I just haven't really heard of it. Right now, Yemen predominantly is Shafi'i, to the best of my knowledge, just like Somalia and most of East Africa, frankly, because they were under Yemeni influence. So a lot of them are like Ba'alawi Shafi'is and that type of thing, Ash'ariyah and whatever. So yeah, that's just the situation in Yemen. Next question coming in. Might come off as a bit informal, but I wanted to ask you regarding the supposed vacuum of Muslim literature, more specifically novels. Writers like Dostoevsky and or Tolstoy, while their works may not be termed as Christian literature, Christian thoughts, ideas were a central influence in their works. Well, I wanted to ask you about their Muslim counterparts. I'm aware of the rich tradition of poetry, but have never encountered novelists from our tradition. Are you aware of any? Well, so this is something that historians of Arabic literature talk about all the time. Okay. The novel, the word novel, the idea novel, as in a book, fiction book, is a modern Western construct. That did not exist before modernity, not even in Europe. Okay. So, what are you talking about when you talk about novels in our tradition? Our tradition didn't have that concept of novels until the modern period with colonization. Now, if you want to know like modern fiction books written by Arab authors, my favorite is probably Tayyib Saleh. Tayyib Saleh, he is from Sudan. He has a really good book, Seasons of Migration to the North, and he has one called The Wedding of Zayn. Both of those I highly recommend checking out. They talk about colonization, village Arab life, race, and mental health, and those types of things. Like they're really super interesting. There's all kinds of great modern authors. There's this one guy, what's his name? Jaloun, and who writes in French. I forget his name now. Taha. Okay. Taha bin Jaloun is a really good, you could say, Arab novelist, but he writes predominantly in French. He is from Morocco, and his first novel was L'Enfant du Sable, The Sand Child. I have some of his books there in the other room. So yeah, I like his stuff too. He has a book, Le Nuit Sacrée, The Sacred Night, Les Raisins de la Galère, The Fruits of Hard Work. And sorry for my bad French. But yeah, he's got a lot of good stuff. So I mean, there definitely is people in modernity who are writing, really amazing pieces of literature. And I'm, saying the French names and stuff, but these have been translated, many of them, into English. So yeah, there's a long list of his stuff that's been translated into English. So, but yeah, Arabs have predominantly expressed themselves either through akhbar, which is kind of like khabar means clause or like a report, a piece of news, piece of information, piece of history. And what they would do is they'd do little kind of short stories that they call the khabar, and they would be edifying. So if you want an example of like pre-modern Islamic kind of like fiction literature that's not really a novel, I would recommend you check out Al Bukhala by Al Jahaz. Al Bukhala means it's like stingy people. Singular is bakhil, means someone who's uh, yeah, stingy, that just wants to keep their money to themselves, never ever be generous in their lives, like Scrooge or the Grinch or something like that. And so it's all these comedic, funny stories that Jahith wrote about people who are not generous. And we all know generosity is like the biggest like Arab virtue, right? So, you know, they want to, of course, through these funny stories, and they truly are hilarious. Um, you know, you get to see like the value of generosity being like inculcated or socialized. And Jahrith was an Islamic scholar, an alim, a sheikh, but a mu'tazili one. Okay, so kind of beware of that. Although you don't really see like mu'tazili ideas in al-Bukhala, although I could be wrong on that. I'm not an expert on Jahrith, but I've just read chunks of it. And Islamic culture is imbued in it. Like everything's halal. Nothing I found in it was heretical. But like I said, I haven't read it all, read excerpts. But yeah, I think it's a good thing and beneficial to read. So there's all kinds of like pre-modern literature like that, but they don't call them novels. One I really like from Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi, and many don't know, but he started writing literature before he ever wrote anything in the Islamic sciences. So he was like a writer before he got religious and learned. And he wrote a really great book that even at El Medina University, you can find it in their library, called Tawqa Hamama, which is like, it can be the necklace, the crown, or the ring, or, you know, something like that, or the dove. People debate about the meaning of Tawqa, but Tawqa Hamama is the name of the book. And it has been translated into English. Um, there's another one from Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi called Kitab al-Sadaqa, where, like the Book of Friendship. And that's a nice piece of pre-modern Arabic literature that I really enjoy. Um, so yeah, there's all kinds of examples that aren't technically novels. Like I said, that's a modern construct, but there's all kinds of pre-modern Islamic literature out there. Kalila wa Dimna is another one. Majnun wa Layla. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. 1001 Arabic Nights, you know, which is what is it? Alf Layla wa Layla. So yeah, all kinds of stuff out there. Okay. Is the battle of I can't see it there, it's covered up. The origin of paper in the Islamic world. So I'm assuming this is the battle between the Chinese Empire and the Islamic Empire. That is actually a historical fact. I have a book on it from Princeton University Press. I think it's called uh, The Arabic Book, a History or something. Let me see if I can look it up here. Yeah, it's just called The Arabic Book, Princeton University Press by Johannes Peterson. And so, and it's also Jeffrey French who translated it, apparently. So it was written in Danish, then Arabiska book. Um, and I'm Norwegian, by the way, so I actually speak Norwegian, and Danish ain't far off. Um, I grew up here, and my great grandparents speaking Norwegian back in Minnesota, where I'm from. And so, yeah, this was published in 1984, and there's a whole section in the book where Peterson goes over um, how paper came to the Islamic world and how the codex or book became a thing in the Muslim world, how it was done with parchment before paper. But the advent of paper made a big deal. These collections behind me and like Musnad Ahmed and things like that, none of that would have been possible before paper. Because if you think about one piece of vellum that could possibly make four sides, because you get one piece of vellum and you stitch in the middle to bind it to the book. And so you have something like this. And each palm of my hand could be a paper you write on plus the back sides. And so one piece of vellum like that is like half a goat. That's like maybe one entire goat if it's a smaller one. And goats consume a lot of water. They consume a lot of plants. Raising a goat to maturity to slaughter it, you're not just slaughtering it for its vellum. You got to slaughter it also concerning when you want the meat, if you are shearing it, or something for its fur. Like there's all these other concerns, the milk the animal produces and things. So anyways, vellum is really hard to come by and it's really expensive. And some of the early Qur'ans that were made out of vellum, you're talking about like they had to slaughter like 600 goats to make a single Quran, which in those days was a huge, massive amount of money. So big multi-volume collections were not really possible. And that's why we don't really see too many of them in the early period. And it's also why the early books are meant to be like mnemonic devices. Okay, it's to like help you memorize something, and it's meant to be like really concise. And once paper comes in, then boom, you see this huge explosion of all of these multi-volume works in the Arab world. So it clearly came in at a certain time, and it clearly had an impact on how things functioned. And it happened shortly after that battle with China. So I think the evidence is extremely strong. You hear this mentioned in, Arab sources that it was through this battle and whatnot that technology came to the Muslim world. I don't really see anything that would make me be suspect of that narrative. Ooh, more questions are coming in. How the office of Şeyhülislam worked in, okay, so that I don't know a whole lot about off the top of my head because I'm not an Ottomanist. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a book called The Second Formation of Islamic Law written by Guy Burak that covers the history of the, like Hanafi bureaucracy in the Ottoman Empire. And it talks a lot about the role of Şeyhülislam in kind of determining Hanafi fiqh for the empire. So I would look there first, and you might see other things cited and things like that. Who was the best Somali president? Ooh, that's a big one right there. That'll get you in trouble answering that question. I know that in terms of my kufi here, I wear the biggest size that you can buy because I have a fat head. So in that sense, I'm already madahwain. Okay. Okay, all right. I'm already the president of Somalia, so I'm going to endorse myself on that one. Okay, I don't want to get into the politics between Djibouti and Somaliland, and this stuff with Hargeisa, Somaliland, and Puntland, and South Somalia, and how Kenya took a chunk of Somalia, Ethiopia took a chunk of Somalia, who are the Ogaden? Why do they speak Somali, but they're not in Somalia? When I lived in St. Cloud, Minnesota, you could call it Ogaden City because everyone there is from Ogadania. All right. So these politics are really complicated. And I just want to see the greater Somalia unified. So whatever president can unify greater Somalia with a nice progressive vision, I think would be a really good thing. And I do think some violence is going to have to happen for that to work. I think one of them needs to conquer the rest of them. You can only unify by force. But of course, we have to ask ourselves, why is Somalia divided? Somalia is divided because of international politics. It's not because of tribalism. I think tribalism is really like something to cover up what's really going on. And what's really going on is Saudi Arabia wants to control Hargeisa, Somaliland. America is desperately got their thumb on Djibouti. They have a huge, one of their biggest naval bases is on Djibouti. They got their thumb on southern Somalia, Mogadishu. Okay. And there are all these different, they're all vying to be internationally recognized. It's just like it's a problem. Okay. And then you have Al Shabaab, who I think might be funded by the same maybe Gulf states or something like that are, and maybe the United States has something to do with it too. But I think Al Shabaab is supported by nefarious international actors to cause instability and chaos in Somalia. I do suspect that Somaliland might be somehow involved with Al Shabaab in trying to create instability around the Mogadishu region. But it's conjectural. There's no hard evidence that people have found, but you could see why they might want to do that. Okay, I'm going to have husnul one and assume good about them, but you can see from like a logical standpoint how that would benefit Hargeisa if they had, Al Shabaab creating all this chaos around Mogadishu. The UN needs to get their nose out of crap like that. The United States needs to get all their stuff out of Somalia. See, the reason why Somalia is the way it is, they don't want it ever to get as strong as it was in the 80s, because the most important maritime shipping route goes right past Yemen, Somalia, up the Red Sea through the Suez Canal. Now, the majority of like Western trade and commerce comes through that, goes to Europe and the United States. Things from Asia come through that, go to Europe, the United States. You know how much stuff comes from China and Southeast Asia that we're buying here in the United States. Most of it's coming through this maritime channel, okay? That's why when the Suez Canal was blocked, it was such a big deal. It was all over the news and causing all kinds of supply chain issues and this and that, right? And it's also the same reason why the Houthis are attacking these maritime ships right now in the Red Sea. It's the same reason that the Gazans are being bombed to oblivion. It's because you can go Google it right now, go search it. There's this thing called the Ben Gurion Canal that they want to build to replace the Suez Canal, which is in Egypt. They want to build it directly through Gaza because they want to be completely in charge as much as possible of this maritime trading route that goes through currently Egypt to the Mediterranean. They want it to go through Gaza into the Mediterranean so that Israel can control the canal, so that the American CEOs can feel more safe about their profits. So that's really what it all boils down to. The reason Somalia is divided is so that it's not strong, so that it cannot disrupt this maritime trading that is going through the Red Sea. And you can go look up news clips right now about the Houthis, attacking American Israeli ships and da 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 da. So yeah, that stuff's all interrelated. You can't really separate them one from each other. It's all part of global, politics, right? And that's what makes it so difficult right now with all the stuff that goes on in the Middle East. People want to be reductionist and say, oh, it's like, Muslims versus Jews, or it's terrorists versus whatever person in charge of whatever Arab country. And it's more complicated than that. We're talking about geopolitics here. Anytime something pops off in the Middle East, every country gets involved. Europe, America, Russia, China, everybody's got their nose in it. And everybody's paying different people to do different things. They got their agents on the ground. They're trying to influence the situation. So it gets very complicated very quick. And most of my Middle Eastern friends who live there or are from there, currently there, all those kinds of things, they're constantly frustrated because they think they're about to achieve peace, things are about to get better, and because of some, foreign government will cause some chaos, blow up the peace deal in their face, and nothing ever materializes. And that's done on purpose. It's all part of the divide and conquer strategy that capitalist oligarchs like to use so much around the world. It's just neo imperialism or neo colonialism, whatever you want to call it. All right. Any good book on the Mamluks? Yes. Okay. So let me look up this. First of all, there's an academic article on the Mamluks that I think is super interesting. It's something like Ibn Taymiyyah's 3 anti-Mongolian fatwas, which I think is really cool. You should look that up. It kind of talks about the history of how the Mongols converted to Islam and such. I also have a lecture on it that I used to give at Mishkah University, which you can find on my YouTube channel. That's on the history of the Mongols in the Islamic world. But let me look up this book here. So, yeah, it's called Mongols and Mamluks, the Mamluk Ilkhanid War, 1260 to 1281. Cambridge Studies in Islamic Civilization. So I'm assuming that's Cambridge University Press. Came out in 2005 by Reuven Amitai Price. Okay. And there's one by Karl Petri, the Mamluk Sultanate. Yeah, those should be a good introduction. Yeah. I think that'll give you sufficient introduction. But like I said, also too, with Ira Lapidus, History of Muslim Societies, or with the Venture of Islam with Hodgson, they all cover the Mamluks. They cover all, like every aspect of Islamic history. So I would start there. Start with those books before trying to go to something specific. The list I recommend on my video, like How to Study Islamic History, you have to read all of those before you go to something super specific, or you don't have the whole picture, like the bird's eye view. It's like you're trying to study the details of one corner of one room in your house instead of having all the blueprints. So you know everything. And then try to study that one part of the house. How do you know that part of the house is even the most important part or the most interesting part? Why focus on that and not something else? You kind of have to have the whole picture. You have to know the context of everything. Have you engaged with the works of Taha Abdurrahman and Malik bin covers it up here. It covers up kind of part of the chat. It was like a heart or something. Their works make great video topics. So I don't know the Malik one, but Taha Abdurrahman or Abdurrahman Taha, I'm familiar with, and I, in many ways, consider myself a Taha'i. I really do like his philosophical system. The best book in English about it is, I think it's called Reforming Modernity by Wael Hallaq. Let me pull it up quick. I read it when it first came out in 2019. Yeah, Reforming Modernity, Ethics, and the New Human in the Philosophy of Abdurrahman Taha. So yeah, this came out by Columbia University Press in 2019. Highly recommended. I have it in the other room. I think that's probably the best book in English, Abdurrahman Taha, but anybody feel free to correct me if I'm wrong by putting stuff down in the comments. I can't see the comments right now. It's showing me just the chat here. Are you an Ash'ari? I don't really identify as Ash'ari or Athari or Maturidi. I like all three, if I'm going to be completely honest. I think that all three of them are equally valid. I think they all have very compelling arguments. And I do think that the Mu'tazila are, gone outside the fold. the Ibadis and all that kind of stuff, the Khawarij and all that kind of stuff. Like, I consider myself as Sunni. I'm very inspired by what the Maturidis have to say. I'm very inspired by what the Ash'aris and Atharis say. But I think at the end of the day, theologically, I really like Ibn Hazm and Ibn Arabi and their kind of system. They have this logical, theological system that isn't based on deduction or what's called istidlal. And so if you've ever read books on, it's called usul i'tiqad, or like the theory kind of behind aqidah, or how is aqidah derived from the sources, which is called usul i'tiqad. They talk about, these types of issues, how do we interpret a text? Should we interpret it literally, figuratively? How is it different from interpreting a text in, like, interpreting the language and grammar of a text than law? Do we have to be more stringent than the Sharia, than fiqh, or the same? Most would say we have to be more stringent. So yeah, in that sense, I kind of consider myself a Zahiri in theology, which you can Google this, but it's called nominalism. Nominalism is basically like the philosophy of Ibn Arabi and Ibn Hazm, in my opinion, which is where you deny using syllogistic deductive logic, or istidlal, in your theology. For them, because they were Zahiri in fiqh, they also denied it for fiqh. So they didn't use qiyas, or like analogy, in their fiqh, which is why, like, for them, khamr is haram, forbidden, right? The fermented grapes. But beer's not mentioned in the Quran. It's not mentioned in the Sunnah. It's not mentioned in the Zahir. So they might allow that. They never speak on it because they know it's controversial. But if you're not using qiyas, then that's not a conclusion you could jump to, per se. Now, Ibn Hazm, he kind of tried to use some logical finagling to, like, use something sort of like qiyas, but Ibn Arabi repudiated him on that. Ibn Arabi in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah criticizes Ibn Hazm for doing so and says, no, we need to go back to the earlier Zahiri system of not using qiyas. And that's why Ibn Arabi allows a woman to lead prayer over men. Because for Ibn Arabi, he says, look, in the text, in the Zahir texts of the Quran and the Hadith, there is nothing that explicitly says women cannot lead men in prayer. The only way you're doing that is through a logical argument, using this qiyas or legal analogy to say, oh, this is why, women are not included in the imama, leading the prayer. And he says, no, we don't use qiyas. We don't use deductive syllogisms, because he believed that it was corrupted by human psychology. We can be delusional. The Sufis wrote all famous books about delusion and paranoia. And that's why I love Islamic psychology, by the way, if it's not already obvious. But there's this famous book written by Al-Hakim at-Tirmidhi, not to be confused with the Hadith guy Tirmidhi, but they were from the same city. So they both have the name Tirmidhi because that's the city they were from, Tirmidh. And Al-Hakim at-Tirmidhi wrote this famous book, Al-Akyas wal-Mukhtarin, which I published an article on, called The Revival of Sharia's Allegories. And it's called, in translation, the perspicacious, which means like really smart, the perspicacious and deluded. So ghurur means delusion. If you're muhtar, that means you're a deluded person. Okay, so muhtarin, the deluded people. And so this is something that Ibn Arabi, amongst many others, even Imam Ghazali, he has this famous treatise that he wrote at the end of his life called Iljam al-A'wam an al-Kalam, which means like holding back the laity from Ilm al-Kalam, dialectical theology, which is Ash'arism, basically, right? And he was the most famous Ash'ari theologian of his day. But towards the end of his life, he said, don't waste your time with it, because human logic is corrupted by human psychology, our delusion, right? And what's delusion? Delusion is when you hold a belief that is contrary to what most people would say is reality. And for Imam Ghazali, he was the most famous like Ash'ari theologian. He was the most famous Usuli in the Shafi'i madhab. And he decides, or he doesn't really decide, what ends up happening to him is he has like a hysterical breakdown. And that's what the technical clinical term they use in psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic thought is hysteria. Hysteria means you have such severe doubt that it's like crippling. Like, who am I? What do I believe? And it's so crippling that you get like physical symptoms, psychosomatic symptoms. So for Imam Ghazali, all of a sudden he just got all these big doubts. He's like, the rational proofs are not doing it for me. And he couldn't talk, he couldn't eat, he couldn't drink for like a while. And he ended up just like leaving and saying sayonara, and went wandering and wrote his book, The Revival of Religion Sciences, Ihya Ulumuddin. And so it's well known that like Sufis kind of were suspicious of logic, especially istidlal, or trying to get at the dalil. And what they mean by that is not like a hadith, but by dalil, they meant a logical proof. And so every dalil, you have ilatain, which means you have two premises, okay? So how a syllogism works is you could say like, and this is just a hypothetical example. I'm not saying men are actually animals, but you could say, this is a man. That's an irla. You could say all men are animals. That's an irla. So you have the irlatain. Those are the two premises, premise 1 and premise 2. This is a man, all men are animals. Therefore, when you put those together, this man is an animal. That's the conclusion. That would be the end result of your qiyas, or your analogy. Okay. Now, we all know that people out there can start with false premises because of their delusion, because of their psychological state. They'll be like in denial of something. All right. And these are all Freudian terms that we still just use in everyday language. But Freud actually invented them. Denial is Verneinung in German. Okay. I've read Freud in German, the original. And so delusion is something that was talked about in the medieval period by Muslims. And I'm saying all of this to say that for Ibn Arabi and Ibn Hazm, they considered the Ash'aris and Maturidis and even some of the other Atharis, and they considered all of the four madhabs to be possibly caught up in a big ball of delusion. They said, take the words at their apparent meaning, Zohar. Actually, Zohar, I don't think it really means literal. I don't think they were literalists. I think they were suspicious of istidlal. And I think they were suspicious when people tried to use qiyas to make the meaning of a word. So in linguistics, this is called semantics, where how do you know what a word means? Okay. Think of like the word tree. You think of that word and you imagine in your mind a tree. But everybody doesn't imagine the exact same tree. We don't all have the same concept of tree that pops up in our head. Is there a universal tree then? Who knows? Like that's something that's very abstract, right? But how can we all agree on this one term, yet we're signifying slightly different things? And so there would be, Arab grammarians who would argue the meaning of this word is this, and they would use istidlal or qiyas. The word qiyas, to mean analogy, started in Arabic linguistics or Arabic grammar, nahwu wa sarf, before you ever see it pop up in usul fiqh or in usul i'tiqad. And in Andalusia, during the time of like Ibn Hazm and Ibn Arabi, there was this other scholar named Ibn Mabba al-Zahri. Ibn Mabba, he was a specialist in grammar. He was a nahwi, a grammarian. And he wrote a book, Rad al-Nuhat, Refutation of the Grammarians, where he looks at the Basran and Kufan school of grammar, but especially the Basran school of grammar, and he refutes it by saying, look, you can't use this qiyas stuff, this delusional, paranoid logic in trying to create the meaning of words, but rather you should look at just what is the normal meaning of a word, the conventional meaning, and go with that. And so even though we might all imagine a different tree in our head when we say the word tree, like we have a different kind of image that pops up in each of our individual minds, that doesn't mean that trees don't exist or that this word tree doesn't connotate kind of tree in a general sense. So let's go with that. But then the counter argument is, well, how do you know that? How do you come to that conclusion without using logic? Okay. How everyone is then going to have their own individual and subjective literal reading of the text if everyone has a different idea of what those words mean. And so it's kind of circular logic, but so is it with qiyas. So no matter what, you're kind of projecting into the law in some way, shape, or form. But how do you do it the least amount possible is kind of what the scholars tried to get at. How do we make sure that our shahwa or our hawa isn't somehow corrupting our view of the world? Okay. And Ibn Hazm, he liked to use, it's in his usul fiqh book called Ihkam, he liked to use this story where he would talk about imagine you're like an old man with bad vision and someone is approaching you from the distance, which is very common in Arabia, you spread out desert, right? Someone's coming to you from the distance and you're talking with them. In other cultures, you talk with people at a distance. You kind of yell and you still have your conversation, especially in desert nomadic societies. When the Somali immigrants started coming to Minnesota, Minnesotan white people were really shocked. Why are they always yelling? Like you'd have one person on the sidewalk on one side of the street, another Somali guy on the opposite side of the street on the sidewalk, and they're having a whole conversation yelling across the road. And white people thought that was really weird, but that's really normal in desert nomadic societies. And so Ibn Hazm is saying, you're seeing some guy approaching and you're like having this conversation, but at a distance. And your vision's blurry, you got bad eyesight. So you think this person is Zayd, and you don't like Zayd. And he uses the word kabra, like you're arrogant towards Zayd. You speak to Zayd with some condescension, all right? You're kind of, sticking your nose up to this guy. You don't like him. And then this figure, Zayd, starts walking closer to you and comes better into your vision, and you realize, oh, that doesn't look like Zayd. I think that was Amr. And then you hear the voice better. As he comes closer, you hear the voice more clearly. Oh, that's Amr's voice. So for sure, now this is Amr. And you're excited and you treat him good. But before, you weren't treating him as good because you thought he was Zayd. So you started from a false premise. And that was your own mind's delusion. How do you know you're right? How do you know you're not deluded? Is what the Wahhabis say. So how can you just use only logic to make this analogy and da-da-da-da-da-da, so on and so forth? Says, no, maybe we need to use our senses, but we need to use logic to analyze our senses, but not logic to like project out in the world these conclusions we don't really know are true. And so I say all of that to say I kind of agree with them. I kind of agree with Ibn Hazm and Ibn Arabi when it comes to, Aqidah in that regard. So, but I respect all of the schools like Ash'ari, Athari, Maturidi. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell where I'm at. I hope that kind of answers the question, but doesn't maybe fully get at everything, but I try my best to explain it. So how to read a history book. So I talked about that earlier. You can go back and rewatch this live after it's done. But I've talked about that quite extensively already in this session, which I'm going to end soon. So let's try to get through these questions here. What about Taymiyyan theology? Let's consider Athari. I see a lot of modern Islamic philosophers sympathizing with Ibn Taymiyyah and affirming secondary causation and his linguistic principles. Well, I mean, that's up to them. It's a valid school of Islamic theology. You can be either Athari, Ash'ari, or Maturidi, and they all generally agree that they're all Sunnis and they're all part of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Although you have some extremists in each camp that try to, excommunicate the others, but I really think that's an extreme approach. Wouldn't Ibn Hazm make takfir of Ibn Arabi? I don't think so. They have the same aqidah, which I just got done explaining. The Ash'aris, Maturidis were nominalists too. That I would disagree with. Nominalist means you deny that there's universals, like that deduction or istidlal is a universal proof. They would disagree with that. That's why I said that Waharis are actually nominalists and not literalists. Ash'aris and Maturidis, they use way too much universals to really be called nominalists. I heard it was only after around al-Ghazali's time that the majority of ulama became Ash'ari. That I don't know, like what the demographic century after century, like what percentage of Muslims were Ash'aris. I don't think that's true just based on the Ash'ari texts and other like historical sources that I've read, because Ghazali's main teacher was al-Juwayni, who was a big Ash'ari scholar, Imam al-Haramain. And there was a lot of people that preceded Imam al-Juwayni and, writing about Ash'ari theology. So there's a lot of scholarly production, which would indicate that there probably was a decent school, because people have to patron that scholarship. It costs money to sit and write books. It's not free. You're not working on a farm or tending your crops or animals. If you're sitting writing a book, someone's got to pay for that. Someone's got to sustain that person who feeds them and clothes them. Maybe they got their own business or whatever, but so the fact that there's a lot of Ash'ari books before Ghazali would indicate the opposite. Even the maqalat of Ash'ari himself is pretty robust. So isn't that the reason Ibn Hazm believed Isa alayhi salam? I'm not sure what that's referring to. Believed Isa alayhi salam died. That I'm not familiar with. This is the Ibn Arabi related to Wahdatul Wujud concept. Yes, that's Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi. But he never used the word Wahdatul Wujud. That was ascribed to him by later people. So I don't think he would use that term to describe his own concept of theology. I think he believed the same thing that Ibn Hazm believed. Wouldn't Ibn Hazm believe that he is heretical? No, as I just explained earlier, he has this exact same aqidah as Ibn Hazm. Wasn't Ibn Taymiyyah a nominalist? I would not agree with that, because Ibn Taymiyyah did use qiyas. And that means he believed in a universal logic, that deduction was a universal proof, logical proof, which would mean he wasn't a nominalist, vis-a-vis the Waharis, who denied that universal logical proof. And with that, I think I'm going to end this live. It's been fun. Put in the comments below if I should do this more often, and maybe I will, because I think it's just kind of fun to see what stuff you guys want to know and to talk about things maybe I don't usually talk about. All right, thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.